31-year-old Paxton Wallace was found brutally killed in her own home, and police say, of all people, by her longtime boyfriend who reportedly called 911 himself, claiming he did it because she was possessed. But this suspect reportedly has a criminal past that raises serious red flags, and her family now believes that Paxton may have been trying to leave this relationship. We are going to break down the details of this tragic story with a criminal defense attorney who has seen cases like this from every angle. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Real quick, let me say this. Do you know why we can cover an important story like this? It's because of the support that we get from Morgan & Morgan, our sponsor. I'm talking about America's largest personal injury law firm. I'm talking about a firm with over 1,000 attorneys who have recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. In fact, in the past few months alone, a client in Florida received $12 million when insurance offered just $350,000. In Pennsylvania, another client was awarded $26 million. That is 40 times the insurer's offer. And Morgan & Morgan, they make it so easy to fight for what you deserve. You can start a claim from your phone. So if you're injured, you can start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. You can click the link below, or you can scan the QR code on screen. This case that is unfolding out of Phoenix is one of those tragedies that stops you cold. 31-year-old Paxton Wallace was found brutally killed in her own home, allegedly at the hands of the man that she had been with for years, somebody that her family had welcomed into holidays, someone that they seemingly trusted. According to police, her boyfriend, 47-year-old Jeffrey Rael, called 911 before dawn, claiming not only that he killed Paxton, but that he did it because she was, quote, possessed. And at the center of it all is the most haunting question that this case raises, one that goes far beyond the word possessed. What was really happening behind closed doors in the months, maybe even the years, leading up to that night? So here's the case. Paxton Wallace was living in Phoenix. According to her family, she was this warm, steady presence in their lives, somebody who loved her faith, loved her two dogs, always made time for Sunday breakfast with the people that she was close to. But she had been in a long-term relationship with a man named Jeffrey Rael, someone her family says that they genuinely thought that they knew. According to statements that they made to AZ family, they'd spend holidays with him, they opened their home to him, they had all of this time, these memories with this guy. And while there were things in his past that certainly raised questions later, and we're going to get into that part separately because there's a lot there, the family says nothing had ever screamed danger to them. Not in the way that would make someone believe something like this could ever happen. From the outside, nothing leading up to Paxton's death publicly signaled what was about to come. But looking back, the family now says there are elements of this relationship that maybe deserve a closer look, and we're going to unpack what those moments are. But then you go to the morning of November 7th, it's a Friday, and everything shatters, everything changes. According to a release from the Phoenix Police Department, at around 3:40 a.m., police claim they get a call from Jeffrey Rael himself. And he reportedly tells the dispatcher that he has killed Paxton, and then adds a claim that sends this entire case into this unsettling, almost unreal direction. He allegedly said he did it because she was, quote, possessed. So when officers arrive at the house, they walk into this scene that is chaotic and horrific. According to court records that were reviewed by AZ family, Jeffrey Rael is still there. He's holding a hammer and a cross. Inside the home, police find Paxton dead. And this is the part that is especially unsettling, is how severe her injuries were. So severe that she's unrecognizable. That's based on the reports. There is a chainsaw in the kitchen, and this chainsaw was reportedly covered in blood, hair, and biological matter. So this guy, Rael, was detained. He was taken to a hospital first. He was later booked into jail. He's charged with first-degree murder. He's being held on a $1 million bond. And we'll talk about his criminal case, innocent until proven guilty, absolutely. What is the evidence against him? We'll talk about it. But meanwhile, Paxton's family, from a human point of view, who had been preparing for Thanksgiving, which they say was Paxton's favorite holiday, they suddenly find themselves planning her funeral instead. All right, so before we go any deeper into this case, I wanted to bring in somebody who can actually walk us through what all of this means from a legal, from an investigative standpoint, because there's a lot to unpack here. I want to bring him back in, criminal defense attorney Eric Faddis. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time. Before we even get into this case specifically, can you explain how, someone who's been on both sides, right, the prosecution and defense, you tend to look at a case like this when you're first hearing it because it's hard to separate it. There's the human aspect from it. There's the brutal nature of it. You have a defendant, yes, who's innocent until proven guilty, but how do you first approach something like this?
Oh gosh, well, certainly some chilling allegations here in this case, Jesse. I mean, from a prosecutor standpoint, one of the first points of contact is the victim's family. You're going to learn not only how this affected them, but possibly the history of this relationship. On the defense side, you kind of have to try to have a detached, objective legal analysis. You have to explore what avenues you might be able to pursue, notwithstanding the gruesome nature of the alleged facts.
And with your background in special victims and domestic violence cases, is this something, the allegations right now, is this something that stands out to you as an outlier, or have you seen, brutal crime scenes like this before? And again, we'll talk about what potential defenses could be.
Jesse, unfortunately, in my experience, it is common that domestic violence relationships, more so than almost any other relationship, has the potential for lethality. And sometimes it escalates into, a gruesome set of circumstances like we have here. It's really, unfortunately, a pattern that can sometimes repeat in communities and it is not terribly well addressed by the legal system and sort of has an upward trend recently, which is alarming.
And one of the aspects of this case that makes it particularly chilling is if the allegations are true and he did this, the family's shocked. There is this sense that we knew this guy for years. We had no idea that someone like this would be capable of it. Again, assuming that he did this, right? That is something I think I've seen in a lot of cases before, like whether it's a domestic violence case or a murder case or what have you. But domestic violence cases particularly, you have this idea where there's maybe an image that the public sees, that the family sees, that the friend sees, but you don't know what's going on behind closed doors or who somebody really is.
Oh, exactly. And that's why these things can be so shocking. They can be so shocking for the victims' families. Domestic violence, like you said, it's not something that often happens out in the open. It doesn't happen in front of a ton of witnesses, typically. It's often behind closed doors. It is a private hell that some of these survivors and unfortunately alleged victims have to experience sometimes for years without even their closest family or friends becoming aware of it. It's just a very private and sensitive matter, and people are sometimes disinclined to speak out about it as well.
Can I talk to you about this 911 phone call? Because it's strange on a number of levels, but to have a suspect allegedly confess over the phone in the middle of the night, right, in the early morning hours, is that common in homicide cases?
That one, at least in my experience, is not terribly common. Oftentimes the 911 call comes from the alleged victim, the person who is on the receiving end of an assault or threats or something worse. Here the alleged culprit where the perpetrator is expressing what he's doing and why he's doing it, I think is really illustrative. It does rise to the level of alleged confession, certainly problematic for the defense.
Now, we have to talk about him allegedly saying that he did this because she was possessed. My first thought is, okay, we're talking about Arizona insanity defense, right? Where a person could be found guilty except insane if at the time of the criminal act that person had a mental disease or defect, that they didn't know the criminal act was wrong. So first, if it's a law school example, you say, oh my gosh, they killed somebody thinking they're possessed, thinking, they must not be in their right mind. But to call 911, that would signify to you, right? They knew what they did was against the law. They knew what they did was wrong. Or am I not thinking about it the right way? Or is a criminal defense attorney going to jump on this?
No, I hear you totally. I mean, that call kind of shows a consciousness of guilt. Why would you get police involved if you didn't do anything wrong, if you were kind of saving this person from demonic possession? The call to police indicates that he appraised the wrongfulness of the conduct. And then you look at these sort of multiple weapons that are found at the scene. There are other artifacts like a cross, and those things, the hammer, the chainsaw, all of these things together show that there was some thought put into this. There was some planning put into this, and that cuts against an argument that the defendant was not guilty by reason of insanity.
How do they test for that? How do they know? It's not right. It's not a criminal defendant at this point in time whether they're insane. It was at the moment. How do they know at the moment whether somebody was afflicted with some sort of mental disease or defect that they couldn't appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions? Is it a battle between different mental health experts? Is it trying to understand what officers observed at that moment? How long can that mental disease defect, that mental affliction, be processed for? Again, what is the test?
Yeah, so typically how it works, Jesse, is the defense, if they're exploring that not guilty by reason of insanity defense, they will have a comprehensive mental health evaluation for their client with a professional who is trained in doing this type of analysis. The professional usually does an in-depth interview with the defendant, asks about what happened that day, what happened in the days and weeks leading up to this. They look at evidence at the scene. They try to determine if there is some disconnect between what the defendant is saying and what the objective reality is. On top of that, they have to find a mental disease or defect. It can't just be, I was having a bad day, or I had a kind of a panicky break or something like that. It's usually got to be more severe than that. And then the prosecution would get a chance to do an evaluation, the findings of which often differ from the defense's evaluation.
Were you surprised that he was immediately hit with the first-degree murder charge? I mean, from your background, what would be factors that would lead authorities, prosecutors, to immediately go forward with that charge? Because, I mean, I'm covering other cases where you don't see that immediately. It takes some time to figure out what had happened. First-degree murder, what does that tell you?
One thing it tells me is the prosecution is taking this extraordinarily seriously, and that they think even at this early stage, they have the ammunition to bring the most serious homicide charge there is, first-degree murder. One potential issue is that they're going to have to prove premeditation. They're going to have to prove that he did this after deliberation. And while there is some evidence of planning, I think defense might argue that, hey, this was like a psychotic break that happened in the spur of the moment for which there was no history leading up, as the family has said. And so proving the first-degree murder charge, premeditation and after deliberation, is going to be a hurdle.
I'd say, other than the brutal nature of this, one of the hardest parts of this story, one of the hardest pieces of this story to understand, to grasp, and something that only really emerged after Paxton's death, is, again, what her family now believes she may have been going through in the weeks, the months leading up to all this. Because in the immediate aftermath of her death, her sister Alita and her Aunt Tiffany, they both spoke to AZ family about how Paxton had actually been seemingly trying to get out of this relationship. Her Aunt Tiffany told the outlet, quote, she was trying to get out. She was trying to reach out for help. There are shelters, there are places, but there's a wait list. There's a lottery. It's a hope you get in. According to the New York Post, Alita said that Paxton, quote, was trying to get out of the relationship, but was concerned that she was actually suffering in silence. She was not letting her family know what was really going on. And they didn't really get into too deep of specifics, but the way that they described it suggests that she may have been looking to get help quietly, maybe even cautiously, the way a lot of people in difficult relationships do. Eric, is that true? Is there difficulty for people to get the help that they need to get out of a potentially abusive relationship or dangerous relationship?
Jesse, I've seen it time and again, sadly, how difficult it can be for some of these folks to leave these abusive relationships. On the one hand, they often fear their abuser and what could happen if they try to leave and aren't successful. In addition to that, often there's a cycle of domestic violence whereby the abuser perpetrates, but then soothes and consoles, and then the cycle starts all over again. On top of that, sometimes there are economic impediments. Dependency can rear its ugly head in these kinds of things. So a number of reasons why it's so difficult for these folks to get out of these relationships, even when they want to.
And the invisible part of it, right? So her sister told AZ family, quote, no one wants to say that someone who said they love them is hurting them. That's a real statement. Now, from a legal point of view, Eric, it's not evidence from investigators per se. It's not something documented by police, but this is the family's apparent understanding of what might have been happening behind closed doors. Is this a piece of evidence that would come into a trial? Would they testify about this? Is it too speculative? How important is it as part of the investigation?
Well, hey, the family can testify as to their observations of the nature of the relationship, how the relationship may have changed over time, that kind of thing. And in the domestic violence context, as a prosecutor, you are always deeply investigating. Were there prior acts? Was there abuse in the past? Did it escalate over time? Because that's often how these domestic violence cases play out. And if there are prior incidents, prior calls to police, prior calls for help, prior observations of bruises or PTSD-like syndromes. All of those things are potentially on the table when we get to the jury trial phase.
And going back to something, well, is this a kind of case, and these are based on their statements, their recollections, their understanding of what was going on, but is this a kind of case where there's so much attention that they look now into this idea of the shelters, the lottery system? I mean, are they investigated? Is it true that there's a wait list? Is this something that would be explored?
It should be. It darn right should be. In Colorado, where I practice, there are a number of resources for folks who are experiencing this. And sometimes it is difficult to get a bed in these places. Sometimes there are just limited opportunities in that sense. And so I think it's important to look at, hey, are we giving our communities the tools that they need to protect themselves, to get out of these relationships safely so that someone doesn't get stuck and God forbid something like this allegedly happens?
I got to get into the criminal history because that's another piece of the story that apparently didn't come out until after Paxton's death. It's something her family says they actually did know about, at least in broad strokes. We're going to get a little bit more granular here because they knew that Jeffrey Rael had a criminal history. They just didn't think that it would ever come to something like this. But when you actually lay out what the record is, and we don't really know if they knew the specifics of what his record was, you start to see a pattern here, okay? Because according to court records, his apparent earliest major case goes all the way back to 2012 in Maricopa County, Arizona, and this wasn't something small or vague. The charges on the record were for aggravated assault, multiple counts. Now, one of those counts resulted in a guilty conviction. The others were dismissed seemingly as part of the process. But right away, more than a decade before he met Paxton, he already had a violent felony on his record. You fast forward 10 years, 2022. He ends up facing another criminal case in Arizona, again, a multi-count complaint. The problem with this is the details of the charges. Oddly, they're not actually listed in the docket, but what we do know is that one of those counts did end in a guilty conviction in January of 2023. The others were dismissed. Eric, when you look at something like that, A, how does that factor into the current case? Okay. And B, how much does that matter when evaluating risk in a new relationship? So you're talking about two things here, right? You're talking about A, how does that factor legally into the case? And B, as someone who has experience in this, is this something you've seen? Does it factor into evaluating risk in a new relationship?
Sure. So what appears clear from the record is that this defendant had a history of violence. This was in his past. He has gotten physical before. And so, especially from a prosecutor's standpoint, that's aggravating, right? It's not something that just came out of nowhere, some kind of fluke when this guy was 47 years old. It's something that has been apparently in his past before. And so that may cause prosecutors to take an even more serious approach to the case. In terms of approaching a relationship, gosh, oftentimes these folks might not be privy to that information. It's not always easy to find, criminal history of a person from 2012 unless you're kind of in the business of doing that. And so when you have an unwitting young woman who simply is, looking for love, that might not be front of mind. She might not even have access to that information.
This would come out in his trial if he what? If he, A, is found guilty and during sentencing, I'd imagine, or B, if he were to take the stand, couldn't he be confronted about his prior criminal history?
There are a number of ways it could potentially come in. So if the prior act was so similar in nature, for example, if it was also domestic violence, if he also used a weapon, if it is similar enough, the prosecutor could try to get it in as a prior act in the trial itself. However, I think that's somewhat unlikely. If he testifies and he tries to say something like, I'm a peaceful guy, I wouldn't do this, this is out of character for me, or something like that, they would say, well, wait a sec. What about in 2012? Look at this court record we have here, aggravated assault felony, man. Lastly, it could certainly come in at a sentencing phase. The judge wants to know not only what happened in this case, but the individual's criminal history and what kind of risk they might pose in the future if there was any possibility of being let out, which it seems kind of grim right now.
By the way, just a little legal point of view, it would be difficult to put it in the prosecution's case in chief as a prior bad act if 2012, because it's so far, it happened so long ago, right? That's one of the difficulties, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It's very attenuated in time. If this had been like a pattern with recency with respect to the incident, it would be easier to try to convince a judge to let it in. But I think the likelihood is low. Yeah,
the 2022 one, 2023 one, maybe. But look, here's another point that I wanted to address to you. Obviously, this case is deeply shocking on its own. The problem is, it seems it also happens to fit into this broader pattern that experts are watching across the country, because according to recent data from the Council on Criminal Justice, violent offenses in general in Phoenix and other major U.S. cities, they're actually declining in the first half of this year compared to the same period in 2024. There is one glaring exception, and that is domestic violence, because unlike other violent crimes, DV incidents have risen by about 3%. Are you surprised by that stat, that we're seeing it rise by about 3%?
It's certainly alarming, Jesse. It's not the direction we need to go as a society with this. And you know, you look at a domestic violence case as compared to like a bar fight or something. And with in the DV context, it can be cyclical, it can be repetitive, it can happen over and over again. Whereas, you know, an assault at a bar based on a disagreement or something is usually an isolated event. So just by the very nature of this domestic violence context, it does make sense that there is the risk of the trend increasing, of this happening at a greater frequency over and over again until we get to this level of lethality, which is something as a society we have to try and intervene on.
The only thing, and I can't say this for sure because I didn't do the study, I don't know a lot of stats, a lot of aspects of the study. I guess a silver lining could be, if they're saying there's an increase in domestic violence, which is horrible, the silver lining could be more people are reporting it. One of the problems that we see is that it's unreported, that people suffer in silence. They don't mention it. So the only way that they would know these stats are increasing is because it is going more reported, which is a good thing. Am I looking at it the right way?
That very well could be a contributing factor to the statistics that we're seeing. Because like you said, this happens behind closed doors. Oftentimes people are embarrassed by it. They don't want to tell their family that they're being victimized by a loved one. They don't want to come out in the community. They don't want to be subjected potentially to criticism or ridicule or a harsh cross-examination at trial. This is an unpleasant process for anybody who comes forward to report. But the fact that more people are doing it, that's the only way we're going to appraise the nature and severity of the issue, and then look towards insights and answers as to how to try to solve it.
Now, look, let me end on this point. As Paxton's family continues to process this tragedy, they have set up a GoFundMe that we want to put up. And it's a GoFundMe that was helped to cover funeral costs and other expenses. And this is how they describe Paxton in this GoFundMe. Quote, they describe her as somebody who is incredibly bright, selfless, and beautiful. Paxton was resilient and had so many dreams left unfinished. There is no doubt she fought for her life. It is unthinkable that someone we let into our home and family could take such a precious person from us. He promised us he would keep her safe and protect her, and in the end, after years of domestic violence, he took her life. He has been arrested, and we will stand as a family to see that he pays for this crime. As a family, we appreciate all your continued prayers, support, and help. Eric Faddis, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
I'll be with you.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. You can follow me on X or Instagram. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.